From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
The city manager has accepted Officer Wilson's resignation, and as of yesterday, Officer Wilson is no longer an employee with the city of Ferguson. There is no severance agreement with Officer Wilson and the city of Ferguson. The city of Ferguson will not be making a severance payment to Officer Wilson.
As Darren Wilson resigns from the Ferguson police force, protests continue across the country, from shopping malls to football stadiums, over a grand jury's decision not to indict Wilson for shooting dead Michael Brown.
We're interrupting Black Friday commerce, specifically to send a very important message, which is that Black Lives Matter.
We'll speak with youth activists from Oakland to New York, as well as Professor Michael Eric Dyson, who asks, where do we go after Ferguson? Then to Egypt, where courts dropped its case against former President Hosni Mubarak over the killing of protesters in the 2011 uprising that ended his 30-year rule. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Ferguson police officer Darren Wilson has resigned days after a grand jury elected not to indict him for the killing of unarmed black teenager Michael Brown. Ferguson Mayor James Knowles said Wilson will leave the police force with no severance.
The city manager has accepted Officer Wilson's resignation, and as of yesterday, Officer Wilson is no longer an employee with the city of Ferguson. There is no severance agreement with Officer Wilson and the city of Ferguson. The city of Ferguson will not be making a severance payment to Officer Wilson.
Wilson's resignation comes amidst continued protests in Ferguson and around the country over the grand jury decision. Over the past week, there have been demonstrations in more than 160 cities, on public roadways and shopping malls and government buildings. On Saturday, protesters kicked off a 120-mile, 7-day march dubbed the Journey for Justice from Ferguson to Jefferson City, the capital of Missouri. Black Friday was also a day of action as activists staged protests at shopping centers across the country. In St. Louis, 2 malls shut down after protesters staged a mass die-in. In Seattle, police arrested 5 people after protesters marched in 2 malls. At the Pacific Place Mall, activists chain shut 2 doors. At the Westlake Centers, a mass die-in was staged. In New York, 7 people were arrested after a Black Friday action outside Macy's flagship store. A day earlier, 7 others were arrested for trying to disrupt the Macy's Thanksgiving Day parade. On Sunday, demonstrators temporarily shut down part of the busy Interstate 395 highway that runs through Washington, D.C. In Oakland, demonstrators briefly shut down a BART train station by chaining themselves to a train. Members of the National Football League St. Louis Rams also took part in an act of protests ahead of Sunday's football game. A group of players entered the stadium with their hands raised overhead in the hands up, don't shoot pose in a show of solidarity with Michael Brown. The St. Louis Police Officers Associations complained to the NFL, calling for the players to be disciplined. We'll have more on the Ferguson protests after headlines.